Hello, everyone. A very warm welcome on behalf of the Competitive Strategy Interest Group of the Strategic Management Society. This is the third event of recently launched interview series. Our aim is to invite authors of recently published SMJ pieces in order to stimulate more interest both from academia and industry in strategic management research. Today, we are fortunate to have with us Professor Dmitry Sharapov and Professor John Michael Ross from Imperial College Business School. Dmitry graduated with a PhD in strategy at Cambridge University in 2012 and is currently an associate professor of innovation, entrepreneurship, and strategy at Imperial College Business School. His research broadly sits at the intersection of competitive strategy, innovation management, and decision making under uncertainty. Specifically, one stream of his research specifically explores the dynamics of the processes of imitation. Why and who do organizations imitate? And that is related to their paper that we will be discussing today. We also have Jan Michael Ross with us, who joined Imperial College Business School as a postdoctoral research associate in 2011 and is currently an associate professor at Imperial College Business School. Both Dmitry and Jan's works have come out in top journals of the management field. Today, we are going to discuss their recent paper, Whom Should a Leader Imitate? Using rivalry-based imitation to manage strategic risk in changing environments, that was published in a special issue of SMJ. So thank you, Dmitry and Jan, for joining us. Would you like to say a few words before we delve deeper into your work?
Thank you for giving us the opportunity to discuss this work with you. Yeah, just great to be here. Yeah.
Thank you also from my side. Take the time putting it all together and doing this initiative, which I hope is very, very useful for the field. Thank you.
Thank you. So this is really an interesting paper. Because like imitation by organizations is a very widespread phenomenon, but this has been a really puzzling question, like whom should an organization imitate and under what circumstances? So this paper really answers this puzzle, like which strategy and imitating whom will help organizations maintain their performance lead, which is one of the main targets of their strategies. So Dmitry and Jan answered this question, like whom should organization imitate, like in circumstances when there are more environmental changes or when the environment is more quiet. So to start with, would you like to talk a little bit about your motivation for choosing such an interesting context about writing your paper? Like you can talk about academic or non-academic motivations. What led you to choose this context for this paper?
So Jan and I, before this paper, our first paper together came out in 2015 in Academy of Management Journal. And that paper was essentially trying to work out under what conditions might it make sense for a leading organization to imitate its rival in head-to-head competition. And to answer that question empirically, we found that there was a really interesting context where we could observe these strategies, where there was an exogenous source of uncertainty that affected competitors in an asymmetric manner, depending on the strategies they were choosing. And that also had a lot of additional information around it, including videos and press coverage and so on and so forth. Jan, do you want to introduce the context a bit, given your familiarity with it?
Yeah, I come a little bit from the sailing side, and I actually came across during my PhD across a book from Dixit and Nailbuff. I think it's more of a game theory book, and that used the example of sailing in the America's Cup. And in that moment, I realized, oh yes, there is this uncertainty around the wind direction. Where will the wind flow from in the next seconds or 10 seconds or minutes. And as company business leaders know, you have to make your choices even under uncertainty. And in sailing, it's very similar. You have to do your competitive moves. You are out there. You try to stay ahead of the game of your rivals. And but you don't know, because of shifting wind directions, where to go. And then sometimes it's actually better to look backwards to your rival and imitate. I knew that from my own sailing experience, but seeing that example in a strategy econ textbook, I like, oh, that might be legit to go into this direction. And for some years, I struggled getting access to this type of data. And as we see in many fields, many areas, on many topics, we have datafication. And at some point, I woke up in the morning and watched the America's Cup. And on the web pages, there was something saying data download. And I'm like, oh my God. And it was all publicly available, a very fine-grained data on this context, a GPS data where you knew where the positions are of these boats, in data from the organizers of the event, where the boats are allowed to go, what are the boundaries conditions, like in basketball, you're not allowed to go beyond a certain line, detailed information, second by second, wind direction, etc. So we got a lot of information that we actually needed to advance this area and this idea of imitating your rivals when you are actually the leader.
Yes, so to add to that, I didn't know much about sailing before these projects. I still don't know much about sailing. I've learned a little bit through my work together with Jan, but we both had interests around competitive dynamics and strategies under uncertainty. So we were talking about these kinds of things even before the data became available. And once the data was potentially there, we kind of worked out, okay, so what's the simplest question we could potentially look at with this that would still be interesting? And it was this idea of, is it useful for a leader to imitate? Which goes against a lot of the kind of common wisdom. And also the literature on imitation previously has mostly focused on situations where imitation is a form of learning. You're trying to imitate someone because you think they're doing something better than you. But in this case, since you're the leader, that wouldn't seem to necessarily be the obvious explanation. So to cut the long story short, we kind of worked out our theoretical framework for that paper, put together the data, made it workable, thankfully got it through the review process at AMJ. And then the question was, well, what next? So what is the next question we could potentially ask using the setting and its advantages? And that was relatively straightforward. So the AMJ paper was about head-to-head competition, but real competition is hardly ever head-to-head, right? Most companies have multiple competitors in their space or trying to get into their space. And so we were mostly curious, like in this more realistic setting, does it still potentially make sense for a leading organization to imitate? And if so, because you've got multiple targets, who is it that you should focus on?
Yeah.
I can see like this could be, I mean, this is really interesting because in addition to competitive strategy, I see that this has implications in behavioral strategy as well, where an interesting question has been like, what are referent organizations that some focal organizations compare themselves to? And mostly like scholars have been focusing on the industry average or the industry peer group. So I can see like that this paper can advance some ideas in that domain as well.
Yeah, and to add to that, and it resonates with what Dmitry just said, there is obviously imitation literature out there that looks at targets of imitation, but it's the best in the industry, or the average, or the one that is currently succeeding, or maybe a legitimate target, right, for some reputational reasons, etc. And all these alternative mechanisms of imitation, we can, in our data set, we can rule out and then focus on one of the mechanisms. We are not saying it's a better mechanism. We are just complementing the existing research that exists out there. And others have already said that imitation might be useful in uncertain environments, but it was typically not really looking at the leader. And another motivation was then we dug a little deeper into some anecdotal evidence. Some organizations that are actually market leaders and imitating others. And it's interesting, we don't talk much about it, right? We talk about the innovation, but the imitation examples is not really communicated. And in our paper, we mentioned some examples from Intel where they are imitating others and could have copied another firm, right? Their alternative targets, or Coca-Cola in the Japanese market imitating Suntory versus they could have imitated another one, right? So when you look up a little bit, you find some interesting examples where you have multiple potential targets and market leaders that are actually imitating others to stay ahead in the game. And I think it resonates with today's business environments a lot. It's already challenging to climb up the ranks and become the market leader, but staying ahead, that's also not so easy anymore, right? And I think as strategy scholars, we need to give answers there on what to do, and something that is practically relevant too, right? So it's theory development, theory advancement, but also being able to give some advice.
Yes, this is super interesting, and I like the sort of the distinction between sort of imitation strategies and innovation strategies. And imitation is still sort of a very strong element of all firms do business, right? And then so I was wondering, so in the paper you build on the imitation literature and then competitive dynamics, and then I would like could you say a few words about the propositions that you have about all firms use these different imitation strategies, and which ones are more effective under different environmental conditions?
So I think when we started talking about this project and trying to work out how we would approach it, knowing the literature and reading more about it, we saw essentially that there were lots of competing things going on, right? If you focus on the most similar referent, right? Well, potentially you'd be better at imitating them. But what does that potentially leave you open to when someone new comes into the industry with a different strategy, right? Whereas if there was someone different who was becoming second ranked, who's becoming your biggest challenger, okay, so they seem to be the bigger threat, but can you actually effectively imitate them quickly enough for that to make a difference? So we saw all these tensions, and essentially we couldn't really think of how we would hypothesize clear effects one way or the other without basically misrepresenting or ignoring some of the literature, and that's not what we wanted to do. And so we thought, well, let's see if the simulation might make sense as a way of trying to work out what's going on here and what it's contingent on. And essentially, from quite an early point, we thought of the paper as a mixed methods approach, using a simulation to explore some of these tensions in conditions that we can sort of control and modify ourselves, and then trying to triangulate that using this empirical setting of multiple competitor races in the America's Cup, which would give us all this fine-grained data, this source of uncertainty, and nice measures that we could try and use to capture, how effective are you at maintaining your lead against multiple rivals. Do you want to add anything, Jan?
Yeah, I'm just thinking that was very well summarized. So, I mean, what is interesting here is though we kind of knew what some of the alternative mechanisms are, like even within that world that we wanted to explore, we weren't sure what could be a hypothesis that we could really, define ex ante and then test, right? And the simulation was the route to go. We needed to first develop theory. So what this paper became started early out with was a question-driven research paper, right? So like the special issue that we published it in, we had a question: whom should the leader imitate, right? And then we try to find answers, and of course link it to the relevant literature, right? Competitive dynamics literature, we have for example, the dyadic perspective, but here we are going beyond the dyadic perspective because the leader can copy multiple alternative reference, right? There are multiple competitors playing it out in a dynamic competition over time, right? Imitation literature, we mentioned that earlier. The literature on competitive reference, we mentioned that. And then the literature on, let's say, strategic risk management, right? In turbulent environments, you have frequently changing environmental conditions. You have huge shocks, so the magnitude of environmental conditions. And some of those things we can really simulate, right? And that is an advantage to get first to the theory building part and control it in a simulation. And there is some prior work in competitive dynamics that used simulations when you want to study strategies, environmental changes, and having also multiple rivals in the game. A simulation might be a way to go because they are competing over time. We're not just looking at one time window.
And then, so your hypothesis is that firms are going to be are going to have a better performance when they are imitating firms that are closer in terms of their attributes, and times when there is less uncertainty, right? And then the opposite. So when there is more uncertainty, firms would be better off imitating sort of the challengers, right? So the firms that are doing things a little bit differently. And then, so I was wondering, so what are the mechanisms behind these propositions?
Yeah, so indeed, those were the propositions that came out of the simulations and our analyses of them. And essentially, it boils down to two sort of mechanisms, if you like. So one is, what is the likelihood that someone who is different to you gets a favorable environmental shock that basically puts them at risk of overtaking you. Okay, so that's one side of things, and obviously that tends to increase with increasing magnitude and frequency of environmental changes, right? And the other one is, what is the likelihood that you're able to effectively imitate somebody else, right? And that tends to be easier the more similar someone is to you, right? And in the paper, we kind of try and look at the simulation results, try and see what role those mechanisms that were coming out in the simulation were playing in the overall patterns that we were seeing, which you summarized quite nicely. And I think we have a couple of figures there in the paper that do provide some evidence that, at least in the simulation, it's the balance of these things that seems to be driving the overall findings. And that balance is really dependent on magnitude and frequency of environmental changes.
So thank you. I mean, these are like quite interesting mechanisms, such as just like, it's on the one hand, like it's the ability to imitate like with accuracy, and like how far like are the chances that the challenger is likely to get a favorable shock from the environment. So as you said, like once you have described these mechanisms, then it sounds more intuitive. But yes, like beforehand, like it would have been difficult like to hypothesize about these mechanisms one way or the other. So thank you. Now, can you like introduce your data set like and specify like features that made it particularly suitable? I know like you have mentioned it a little before, but can you mention the specific features that made it suitable for your study?
Yeah, sure. I think Jan's touched on some of these, but specifically for this project, the America's Cup World Series that we looked at took place over something like 2 years. And it was a competition between up to 10 different sailing teams, right? So you would have these fleet races with up to 10 competitors, which is obviously a nice multi-competitor setting, which aligns with what we were interested in. But the data itself is pretty amazing if you want to look at competitive interaction. So for every boat, you have, I think, 5 data points per second on their location in terms of GPS positions on their course, on their heading, on their speed. You have similarly fine-grained data about wind direction and wind speed, which is the main source of uncertainty in this empirical context that we're interested in. You have data on, the exact course boundaries, so where they can and cannot sail within this race, which I then converted into measures of how close they were to the edge of the course and things like that for various analyses. And then along with this stuff, we also have data from the judges or the referees. I'm not sure what the right term is, Jan, in the race, that basically they would report when someone's crossed the line. They would report where someone's had a penalty because they've done something against the rules and how much that penalty was, so we can account for all of that. And then I think you mentioned, Martin, the videos, right? The videos were also pretty nice in some cases for us to look at what was going on and to really see that, this is not us projecting some kind of pet story onto the data. You could see in the videos that you have, a helmsman telling someone on the boat, look at the guys behind, when they turn, we're going to turn, right? So this was really helping to make us kind of more comfortable that we were actually capturing some of what was going on in that.
Yeah. In the videos, you can hear how the helmsman, the captain, is basically announcing a decision rule that they are going to apply, right? Conceptually speaking, if you think about strategy as a simple rule, a decision rule that guides follow-on choices, have in mind there are multiple choices to be made. It's not just the steering, it's the sailing tighter, looser, trimming, etc., or where you position the crew. You have to make choices, and once a helmsman communicates the decision rule, the more operational choices follow from that, and the videos were helpful. Another strength here of the data set is these teams have the same technology, right? Of course, in real life, companies compete with different technologies or different setups, but it helps us to reduce some of potential sources of performance variance, right? They have all the same identical equipment, the abilities and the teams and their experiences. Of course, they are different, and we can control for those things. Also for prior competition, potential sources of rivalry, right? So the research on relational rivalries, etc., that we can nicely control for the status differences, etc. And that's really nice that we could capture all these traditional drivers in competitive dynamics and imitation literature to really make sure that we can get closer to our theory, right?
And so there's this amazing figure in the paper where you show these boats are going to be changing direction, right? And then imitating each other. And then so I was wondering how you were able to track the imitation, right? So it would depend on which way the boat is going. And yes, if you could say like a few words about this, or that would be super interesting.
Yeah, so to capture imitation, what we looked at is the data we had on the heading of each boat. So basically which direction in terms of the 360 degrees compass was it pointing in at, whatever, 0.2 of a second, right? And so the measure of imitation that we ended up using in this paper, and I believe also our previous AMJ paper, was essentially looking at correlation in these headings lagged by, I think, a second between the focal boats. So essentially saying if the challenger, the second place boat turned, X degrees in this direction, and then within a second, the leader did the same, for us, that was a measure of imitation. Now, of course, there were concerns from reviewers around, well, is this not just reaction in common to like an exogenous shock? And we did some additional tests to try and rule that out, which is again another strength of the data, having having the wind data there, having other pieces of information that would allow you to try and test that.
Yeah, I would like to add here, it's a strength, but also needed that additional test that was just mentioned. The wind is exogenous, first of all, right? It's a nice feature. We have a clear exogenous measure here, right? That's one thing. And it's common to all competitors, right? Often, we use that word uncertainty. Everybody means something different. And is it a perception or just uncertain for one competitor, not for the others? In our situation, the shocks, the uncertainty, it's common for all, right? And that is really a nice feature to then disentangle the actions, the moves, and the environmental shifts to test that nicely.
Yeah, and then so something that is particular to your paper is that you used simulations to derive propositions, right? And then you tested these propositions in quantitative analysis using the sailing data. And so what motivated this choice, right, of using this sort of empirical design?
So yes, I think it just connects to the question that we had, and essentially that we couldn't find a better way of coming up with some predictions, more or less. I mean, I was also curious about simulations. I'd been interested in writing one myself, and this seemed like it could be a useful opportunity to do that. That would fit nicely with the rest of the approach. But I think, it was a challenging route in terms of the review process. Various points in time, we got pushback from people who either only liked the simulation or only liked the empirics, or just had no interest in one or the other, right? And so it is, I think, a riskier approach where you try and combine multiple methods and you try and do things a bit differently. But in the end, I think the special issue was a good home for the paper. We found an audience, an editor, and apparently reviewers who cared about what we were trying to talk about and didn't get caught up on, okay, I don't know this method, therefore I'm not interested, right? They cared about the topic, they cared about the contribution that we were trying to make. And I think, there's a lot of potential benefits to combining, say, simulation and an empirical approach like we did in terms of triangulation, right? So not only do the both parts have similar findings, but one can also go beyond the other and vice versa. So in the simulation, we control everything. So we know there are no competing influences, there are no other mechanisms that are going to be at play. But in the empirics, we have more potential competitors, we have more sources of threat, we have more additional things going on that we're able to capture and then see, well, even with this sort of expanded set of possibilities, the mechanisms still seem to be there.
Yeah, in the real setting, you have behavior. In the simulation, there's not behavioral forces, right? That is an important point. And the strength of simulation is it's not just doing study 1 and then study 2. Triangulation really means combining and is there something that 1 + 1 is 3, basically, where you without the other study you wouldn't understand the other side. And it's interesting. There's prior work out there that triggered that initial AMJ article on competitive dynamics and head-to-head competitions. And they also looked at what helps you to, for market leaders, the likelihood to stay ahead and avoid dethronement. And they tested actually whether imitation could be a way to stay ahead. And they found insignificant, they find no significance in their results. And they only looked at one leader and follow a challenger, right? So only pairs. But in industries, I'm not sure whether it was only airline, I think it was across airlines, but in industry where you obviously have multiple competitors. So what we then did, we tested in our empirical data, if we only consider empirically 2 competitors, the first and the challenger, whether our results would remain robust. And actually it doesn't. So you really have to consider all competitors in your data set, because the theoretical mechanism cannot just be reduced down to this dyad that I mentioned earlier. It is a result of interactions among multiple rivals here. So we found them basically one explanation why that initial study on head-to-head competition might have found insignificant results. So this is a great example for accumulation of knowledge through multiple different papers, including ours, to find some answers. And it was the triangulation that led us actually to check this and see. And then, of course, it was for us great that it's kind of consistent with what we said and what the other results were, without upsetting prior studies, but contributing to these prior insights. It was a great moment of this research process.
Thank you for explaining in detail the motivation behind this empirical design of combining simulation with empirical analysis, and also building on prior studies and like understanding more mechanism behind results of previous studies, which might have been like insignificant, but how they can contribute to the to future research. Could you please summarize the main findings of your study, like which could be helpful? Like we have discussed like what were your expectations and what are the hypotheses that were derived from simulation. So could you please summarize like the main findings of the study?
In short, I think in the empirical part of the study, we find that focusing on a challenger or your most similar rival, your neighbor, as we call them, but by itself doesn't have any effect, right? There's only it only makes a difference in terms of your ability to stay ahead when you consider also the environmental condition. So in cases where environmental frequency and magnitude changes are low, right? We find that it's more beneficial to focus on your neighbor, so your more similar rival. And I think if you look at the effect sizes, it's something like 0.8 of a second less reduction in performance gap. In that case, when the average performance gap is 3-point-something seconds, so pretty substantial. But the greater the magnitude and frequency of environmental changes, first it becomes less and less beneficial to be focusing on the more similar. But as that increases 1 or 2 standard deviations above its mean, then it actually becomes beneficial to focus on the second ranked rival, so the challenger, and increasingly so the greater that environmental uncertainty. I think that is basically the summary of the findings.
And so one thing that I found interesting is that the main one of the main contributions of the paper is that you look at not only the challenger but also sort of other competitors, right? And then I was wondering if you had thought into looking if firms are aware of other competitors that might not be as strong at a particular moment, but that might be doing things differently, right? And then coming up with new ideas, new products. And then whether they might are they imitating these other firms or not? And then if do you think there would be a way to test that in future research, or?
So we have a control variable in the empirical setup where we talk about we call it other focus. Basically, there could be another imitation target that was not part of our conceptualizing it. I think the results remain robust here. For future research, obviously, once one takes the knowledge that we have generated and goes into an industry setting, there could be an opportunity to apply this kind of thinking, staying ahead of others. That could also be a motive of somebody who is lower in the ranking, right? Think about some industry, let's say airline industry. There could be an airline in the market share rankings on number 5, let's say, and is completely happy in that position, right? They don't want to grow more, they just want to defend it. So it could be that our theory, our thinking, or the type of this rivalry-based imitation could also be an option for them to defend against the, let's say, 6th, 7th, 8th, 10th, and whatever in there, right? So that is one way of advancing the research. One could then also go further and bring in the idea of innovation, meaning new technologies that have been developed in the process of competing, and then somebody who's far behind in the rankings might come up with some breakthrough innovation and use that, and then we have to see whether some market leaders or those that are ahead might imitate that. That might then depend on the capabilities that the market leaders have, right? It could be that the market leader, for example, currently doesn't have the AI capabilities, and somebody back in the rankings at the moment keeps growing extremely fast, comes up with new AI solutions. That could give them a bit of a head start to catch up, actually, right? So you would have to consider many more factors, but control and for some of those that we discovered.
Yeah, I think for us given the setting, right, it's it has the advantages that we mentioned, but it is also limited, right? You have a pretty bounded set of competitors of same technology, so that there's first, all the competitors are aware of each other, right? They don't have any differences in terms of what they're doing technologically. Whereas, different settings, you might have some other twists that you could put on these interactions due to some of the things that Jan was talking about there. But I think I'm thinking just at a sort of high level conceptually about this. For us, such dynamic that you mentioned, where someone's trying to do something different and is low in the rankings, right? For us, if that is effective, they would eventually probably become the challenger, and that's when you would have this dynamics of the leader perhaps trying to imitate someone who is quite different from them, but seems to be quite effective.
Thank you. So, I mean, sorry, Jen, did you want to say something?
Yeah, no, just briefly, in our simulation, actually, when somebody is far behind and then becomes the challenger, then this rival is considered, right, in the game as an imitation target, right? So that process is in there. We just don't have the innovating part, or whatever reason they become second. But in our mechanism, it's in there through some environmental shocks or climbing in the performance.
And do you have ongoing work in this line of research, or what do you think would be the sort of the ways to build on your paper, and then where's the research in that field going about, like imitation and competitive dynamics?
Yeah, so maybe I go first, Dmitry. So one of the things that happened when you work on such a challenging project, just by research design, but also then the literature, you really dive deep in there and you realize, whoa, this whole imitation literature has so many different assumptions. So what happened that with some other co-authors, I started actually to publish or work on a review article that we published in AOM Annals on imitation. And we try to separate some of the assumptions. We're not saying, and neither Dmitry and I in our papers, we're not saying that imitating the best or average, etc., is wrong. It's just one part of the setup, and one part of imitation strategies. Follow the leader, right? But then we say, well, this is an assumption that is what is going on. It could also be the other way around, that a leader follows a follower, let's say. So in that review article, we debate different assumptions and what these different setup assumptions could mean for future theorizing. And we try to give some ideas for future research. Please read the AOM Annals article. I think there's a lot that can be done in the imitation literature. So that is published. And we are also working on a working paper currently, is not yet submitted, where we try to test some of our own theory that we developed in the Hollywood movie in the industry. Resource allocations that you are imitating by taking competitors as a referent, and under more or less uncertain environments that we're looking at. And then we look at that for a market leader, but also for others in the rankings, and find some interesting results.
Yeah, so just to add to that, I think that follow-up project, I think, has a couple of nice additions to this stream of work, in that, you know, in this paper and in the previous one, the decision we've been considering is essentially all or nothing. You kind of give up your current competitive position altogether and then go and all in on imitation. Whereas in reality, you know, companies can diversify, they can have spin-offs, they can go and do allocate resources, not all in one basket, but spread them, right? So in this follow-up paper, we're looking at resource allocations across portfolios of different movie genres. Right, so I think that gets you a little bit closer to how most companies really think and operate strategically. And then secondly, on the uncertainty angle, right? While it's nice to have something very tangible like change in wind direction, well, tangible is maybe the wrong word, but you get what I'm saying. But in reality, again, there are different sources of uncertainty. So in this follow-up, we're looking at uncertainty that is over customer preferences. Right, so our customer preferences for certain genres of movie apparently shifting unexpectedly, but there may also be uncertainty about what your rivals are doing, right? Are you quite sure about what kind of direction they're going to be investing in the next quarter or the next year? Or does it seem like they're all over the place and they're experimenting with lots of different new genre combinations? And how does that type of uncertainty factor into it alongside with the customer preferences uncertainty?
So thank you so much for a very interesting discussion on the paper. I think one last question before ending our discussion. I mean, you have mentioned how this context is pretty suitable for this question that you wanted to study. Do you think, like, are there any limitations of using sports data in strategic management research generally?
You can take this one, Jan. You've got a
I literally had a little bit of interruption with my internet. You can repeat it. I'm not dodging out of that question. I had a bit of an interruption in the tone.
Yeah. So I just asked, like, do you think, like, are there limitations in using sports data for strategic management research generally?
No, no. There are pros and cons, of course, and I think we underestimate in the field the pros. I also published this review article on the use of sports data, and I was part recently of a Druid debate, the Druid conference, where we had to debate a motion about the use of sports data in innovation and strategy research. And we won the motion and say that actually it's not overestimated, it's actually maybe even underestimated. There are lots of benefits that you're having, and take our example a little bit of what we discussed today. By using that, you can actually develop to knowledge generation and accumulation. In our case, we didn't have access with the AMJ paper as well as this SMJ piece on the both sailing data. We didn't have access to company data, very fine grain, that we needed for this. But we wanted to answer our research question and get going. We are not saying this is the final sentence. Now we test our own theory with other data sets, right? So the use of sports can give you an advantage in the methods to develop the insights and then move. But of course, it's not a hammer that you can use for any nail that you see, or maybe something that is not a nail but just appears that is. It has also its limitations, and you have to carefully balance these things. And yeah, again, my pledge is let's see the papers that use sports as a collective, as a portfolio with other papers together, and advance the knowledge there.
Thank you. So thank you very much for joining us today for this interesting discussion. We really enjoyed this conversation, and I hope this really stimulates interest in this paper as well as related strategic management research. So thank you again, Dmitry and Jen, for joining us today.
Thank you to both of you. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much.
Thank you for joining us today for the final edition of this year's interview series. We are currently working on the next season, and we look forward to new discussions on competitive strategy with another set of extraordinary scholars.